England, 1858. The rain fell in a steady curtain against the windows of Halloway Manor, the sprawling estate of Baron Edward Ashworth. Within, firelight flickered across carved oak panels and portraits of ancestors who stared down with unyielding eyes. The house was as much a fortress of duty as it was of stone, and Edward had long resigned himself to its silence. That silence shifted the day she arrived. Isabella Bennett, hired as governess for his young niece, stepped from the carriage with poise that seemed to defy the storm. Her gown, though modest, was neat and pressed, her bonnet framing a face too striking to be easily ignored. A woman of education, letters of recommendation tucked carefully in her bag, yet carrying herself with a quiet dignity that made the servants pause. Edward watched from the upper landing as she was led inside. At first glance, she was simply another governess, necessary, practical, and forgettable. But there was something in the way her gaze met his when she curtsied, direct, unflinching, as though she had weighed the grandeur of Halloway Manor and found it wanting. Introductions were swift. Isabella bowed her head slightly. "My lord, I trust I will prove worthy of the responsibility entrusted to me." Her voice was low and composed, yet he heard beneath it a firmness, an echo of independence. Edward raised his head. "See to it you do. My niece is spirited. She requires guidance." Over the days that followed, he found his eyes drawn to her despite himself. In the schoolroom, he passed by once to hear her reading aloud, not with the rote tone of duty, but with a warmth that brought life to the words. His niece, usually restless, listened in rapt silence. Another time, crossing the garden, he saw Isabella steady the child as she climbed, her laughter carrying across the hedge. The sound unsettled him, stirring something long buried. But the whispers began just as quickly. Among the servants, murmurs rose, that the governess carried herself with too much pride, that her beauty was ill-suited for her station. Some dared suggest she sought to climb higher than her place allowed. Edward heard the talk, dismissed it, and yet when he found her in the library one evening, lantern light gilding her profile as she studied a volume of Latin verse, he felt the dangerous truth of their words. "Most governesses favor lighter reading," he remarked, stepping from the shadows. She closed the book calmly, though her cheeks colored faintly. Most barons do not notice what their governesses read. He should have rebuked her, reminded her of boundaries. Instead, he found himself intrigued. "And what conclusion am I to draw, Miss Bennet?" Her eyes met his, steady as ever. "Only that I value knowledge, my lord. Even if the world prefers, I remain ignorant." Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bow. For the first time in years, Edward felt the still air of the manor shift, not with duty, not with lineage, but with possibility. Dangerous, forbidden possibility. Isabella settled quickly into her new role. In the mornings, the sound of her voice carried from the schoolroom, firm yet patient, guiding the child through arithmetic and Latin recitations. By afternoon, she was seen in the gardens, encouraging sketches of wildflowers and reciting poetry. The young girl adored her, clinging to her hand with laughter that had been absent from Halloway Manor for years. But admiration was not shared by all. Among the servants, whispers curled like smoke. The new governess was too proud, too composed. She walked the halls with her chin lifted, her beauty a distraction, her education unsettling. To some, she was an ornament out of place, to others, a rival they could not name. Edward heard the murmurs, yet found himself unable to rebuke her. Instead, he watched, from doorways, from corridors, from the shadows of his own restraint. He saw the way Isabella's brow furrowed with concentration as she worked late into the night by candlelight, drafting lesson plans. He saw her lips curve when his niece surprised her with a clever answer. And though he told himself it was mere observation, the truth was more dangerous. He was captivated. One evening, passing the library, he paused. Isabella stood near the fire, book in hand, the child asleep in a chair beside her. She had not noticed him yet. Her posture was straight, her expression softened by the flicker of flame. Edward entered, his steps slow on the rug. She looked up, startled, but did not curtsy. Instead, she closed the book gently, as if guarding its words. "You favor the library," he remarked. "Most governesses keep to their rooms after supper." Her lips curved faintly. "Most barons do not trouble themselves with where governesses pass their evenings." He felt a tug at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, but the ghost of one. "And yet here we are, Miss Bennett. Tell me why." She hesitated only a moment. "Because knowledge is the only inheritance I claim without shame. Books have never judged me for my birth, my color, or my station." The words struck him harder than he expected. For a moment, Edward saw not just a governess, but a woman who bore her dignity like armor, a woman who did not beg for notice, but demanded respect by the strength of her presence. The air between them thickened, fragile as glass. Then his knee stirred, yawning, and the moment fractured. Isabella lifted the child into her arms with practiced ease, murmuring softly. Edward watched as she carried the girl from the room, leaving only the echo of her words and the faint scent of lavender in her wake. That night, Edward found himself sleepless. The manor's corridors whispered with restraint, but his thoughts defied command. For the first time in years, he wondered if silence and duty were enough to sustain a life. And in the stillness of his chamber, one truth became clear. Isabella Bennett was a danger far greater than gossip. She was temptation itself. By the third week of Isabella's stay, the manor hummed with more than lessons in laughter. Servants lowered their voices when she passed, though not quietly enough to hide the words. Some called her proud. Others muttered about her complexion, her education, her presence in rooms where governesses did not belong. And though Isabella ignored the whispers, Edward heard them echoing in every corridor. One afternoon, rain pelted the windows as Isabella guided his niece through a French lesson in the drawing room. Edward entered, drawn less by duty than by the sound of her voice. His niece ran to him, proudly reciting a phrase, her small face alight with accomplishment. Isabella's approving nod was subtle, but Edward caught it, and something in his chest shifted. "She is quick," Isabella said, her tone calm, "quicker than she allows herself to believe." "That is your influence, not mine," Edward replied, watching the faintest smile curve her lips. The exchange was harmless, yet when the child skipped from the room to fetch another book, silence fell, heavy, weighted. Edward found himself studying Isabella, the way lamplight softened her features, the way she held herself with both grace and restraint. He should have spoken of household matters. Instead, the words that slipped from him were far more dangerous. "Do you always carry such fire behind such calm?" Her eyes flickered, startled, but she met his gaze unflinchingly. "And do you always seek storms where there should be silence?" The challenge in her tone struck him like a spark to tinder. Before he could answer, footsteps clattered in the hall. A maid entered, pausing when she saw them alone together. The flicker in her eyes spoke volumes, enough to ignite a blaze of gossip before nightfall. By supper, Edward heard the whispers had doubled. Isabella was too familiar with the master. She lingered too long in his company. Servants' tongues spun silence into scandal, and by morning the steward discreetly advised Edward that a word should be spoken to preserve the household's dignity. He dismissed the counsel, yet unease coiled in his chest. That evening, finding Isabella again in the library, he closed the door behind him. She looked up from her work, wary but not afraid. "They are speaking of you," he said, voice low. "Of us." Her jaw tightened. "Then let them. Whispers do not wound unless you grant them power." "You do not understand," Edward pressed. "In this world, whispers can ruin a woman in an instant. A governess may be dismissed with no recourse, her name blackened forever." She rose then, closing the book with quiet force. "Do you think I have lived my life ignorant of risk? I have walked into rooms where I was tolerated at best, despised at worst, and yet I stand. If this post ends in dismissal, I will stand still. But I will not bow to fear, my lord. not theirs and not yours." Her words struck deeper than any blade. For a moment Edward saw her not as governess, not as scandal, but as a woman whose strength defied every rule that bound him. Desire coiled within him sharp and undeniable. "You are reckless," he murmured, yet his voice carried no rebuke, only hunger. Her eyes softened, though her posture remained firm. "Perhaps, but perhaps it is the only way to live." The silence that followed was perilous, alive with everything unspoken. When she turned to leave, her hand brushed his sleeve, a touch so brief it might have been accident. Yet Edward's breath caught as though it were fire. Alone again in the library, he pressed his hand to the fabric as if it carried the echo of her defiance. Whispers no longer drifted in corners, they gathered like storms. Servants glanced too long when Isabella passed, conversations halted when Edward entered. Even his steward's tone had grown sharp. "My lord, the household suffers under speculation. The governess's presence unsettles propriety." Edward dismissed the words, but unease gnawed at him. He knew the truth of it. His own gaze betrayed him. Wherever Isabella stood, his eyes sought her, and the house, keen as hounds, had scented it. One evening, after supper, Edward found Isabella in the music room. The child had long since gone to bed, and Isabella sat at the pianoforte, her fingers brushing tentative notes. She startled when he entered, rising swiftly. "Forgive me, I thought the room unused." "Do not apologize," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Play." She hesitated, then lowered herself back to the bench. The melody was soft, halting, yet it carried a quiet beauty. Edward stepped closer, the music pulling him until he stood beside her. The notes faltered as his shadow fell across the keys. "Why do you provoke them?" he asked, his tone low. "The servants, the household. You know their tongues are sharp." Her hand stilled on the ivory. "I provoke nothing, my lord. I breathe. I teach. I exist. If that is provocation, it says more of them than me." Edward's jaw tightened. "Do you not see the danger? A governess's reputation is fragile. One whisper can destroy it." Her gaze lifted, steady, unyielding. "And yours, my lord? Will your world crumble if you are seen in a room with me? Or is it only mine that risks ruin?" The words struck, clean and merciless. He drew a breath, his restraint fraying. "You are reckless, Isabella." "You make me reckless." Silence pressed in, heavy, suffocating. Then, as if the world tilted, she rose from the bench. Standing so close, he caught the faint scent of lavender and ink. "Perhaps it is not recklessness," she said softly. "Perhaps it is honesty, at last." His hand lifted of its own accord, brushing her sleeve. She did not flinch. His fingers trailed to her wrist, pulse racing beneath his touch. For years he had lived within walls of duty. Now, one touch threatened to bring them crashing down. "Edward," she whispered, his name breaking from her lips like a secret. It was the first time she had spoken it, and the sound was ruinous. He closed the distance, his lips claiming hers in a kiss, fierce with denial and desire. It was not gentle, not measured. It was the collapse of restraint. The music room seemed to vanish, leaving only the storm of their kiss, her hands clutching his coat, his breath ragged as though he had been drowning and found air at last. When they broke apart, her eyes burned with the same fear and longing that scorched him. "This cannot last," she whispered. "They will tear us apart." "Let them try," he said, his voice hoarse. "They have taken enough from me. They will not take you." The door creaked then, a servant with wide eyes, tray clattering to the floor. Gasps, the sound of retreating footsteps. Edward swore, the spell shattered. Isabella's face paled, the weight of what had just transpired settling like a chain between them. "It is done," she murmured. "They have seen." Edward's jaw hardened. "Then let them. I will not deny it." But even as he spoke, he knew the storm had broken. What followed would demand choices neither of them could escape. The next morning, Halloway Manor buzzed like a hive. Servants moved in hurried silence. but their glances spoke louder than words. The kiss in the music room had spread through the house before dawn. No whisper now, but a certainty. The governess and the master, scandal given flesh. Edward entered the breakfast room to find Isabella already there. She rose at once, her face pale but composed. "I should leave," she said quietly, "before the damage grows worse." "No," Edward answered, sharper than he intended. He crossed to her, lowering his voice. "If you go now, you confirm their every word. You walk into ruin, Isabella. I will not allow it." Her eyes lifted to his, defiance glinting through the fear. "You cannot protect me from their judgment. A woman's reputation is not shielded by a baron's word." "Then let it be shielded by his choice," he replied, steady. "By his defiance. Let them call it scandal. Let them call it folly. I call it truth. I will not deny what I feel for you." Her breath caught in the moment. "You speak of truth as though it will not cost you, your peers, your family." "My family has long demanded silence," Edward said, the steel in his voice breaking through. "Duty over desire, propriety over honesty. But what has it brought me? A house of ghosts, a life of echoes. You have brought life back into these halls. I will not return to emptiness." The door opened then, and the steward entered, his expression grave. "My lord," he said stiffly, "the staff are unsettled. They await your word on Miss Bennett's situation." Edward turned to him, his spine straightening, centuries of duty anchoring his tone. "Then hear it now. Miss Bennett remains governess of this house. She remains under my protection. Any tongue that speaks against her speaks against me." The steward stiffened. "But, my lord—" "Enough," Edward cut in. "You will see my words are obeyed." When the steward left, silence returned, heavy but charged with new fire. Isabella stared at him, her lips parted. "You have just invited ruin upon yourself." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then let ruin come, if it brings you with it." Her composure wavered, tears shining though she did not let them fall. She lifted her hand, and for the first time she touched his cheek, not by accident, not fleeting, but with deliberate tenderness. "You are a reckless man, Edward Ashworth." "And you," he said, capturing her hand against his skin, "are the only reason I wish to be." That evening, the manor's great hall stood quiet. Edward summoned the household. Every servant gathered under the stern gaze of portraits past. Isabella stood beside him, her chin lifted, though her hands trembled at her sides. "You have heard whispers," Edward declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Let them end tonight. Miss Bennet is no scandal. She is no trespasser in this house. She is its heart. And should any man or woman here believe otherwise, let them seek employ elsewhere. I will not yield." Murmurs rippled, but none dared step forward. The weight of his authority settled over them all, the truth too firm to contest. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. Only Isabella remained at his side, her eyes wide, her breath unsteady. "You mean to fight them all," she whispered when they were alone. "The whole of society, if need be." He turned to her, his gaze softening. "Not society, only the prison it builds. I do not care for their approval, Isabella. I care only that you remain here, with me." Her lips trembled, and then she smiled, small, incredulous, but real. "Then I remain. Though the world may call me mistress, though the whispers never end, I remain. Because for the first time, the choice is mine." Edward bent to kiss her, not with the desperation of secrecy, but with the certainty of a vow. And in that kiss, beneath the watchful eyes of painted ancestors, the silence of Halloway Manor broke, not with scandal, not with fear, but with the defiance of love chosen at last. If this love story touched your heart, show some love back, like the video and subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments, should their love story continue or end with mystery?